Welcome back. So, for these lectures, we're going to be talking about modern English, which is a period from about the American Revolution into the present day. But since a lot of this is very similar to how we understand English today because it is more recent, we'll just focus on some of the highlights. And so, for the social and political history, we'll focus on some of the continued changes that were happening during this time period and some that even continue to happen today. But just focusing on some of the sort of major features rather than diving into some of the major historical events because there's not really as many that lead to linguistic change in the same way that we saw in all of these previous time periods. So by this point in time, English has already come into its own in its own right. So this happened largely during the early modern period. So by the time we get into the 1800s and into the present day, English as a national language has already been secured in Britain, in the US, in Canada. It was starting to be used in other areas as well. It's the language of scholarship and literature, and that's no longer questioned. So it's sort of taken over its place instead of Latin by this point as the main language for scholarship, for literature. English is now widely used throughout the world for scholarship and for literature, and it started happening at the end of the early modern period and continues through the modern period. There are still debates about vocabulary and spelling reform that have continued, not to the same extent as what we saw during the early modern period, but as you can imagine, when we started creating some of these prescriptive rules, some of these sort of ways that things are supposed to be done, that was happening from early modern English, that's continued to this day. So some of these ideas and talk about the introduction of vocabulary, some of the talk about spelling reform did still continue and does still continue, and we'll see a few examples of that. There's been language purists even as late as 10 years ago trying to banish words from the Queen's English, trying to get rid of words like blog or sale event or body wash, shovel ready, some of these words that were very frequent in the early 2000s, metrosexual, for instance. So these are words that sort of came about as a result of different sort of social things, as a result of different sort of political things. And there's been attempts to banish them, but that's never really going to work. People are going to use what they use, and they're not going to use what they don't use. The American Dialect Society embraces a lot of these changes, and so every year when they have their meetings, they nominate a lot of these words as Word of the Year candidates. Several of them have won categories for Word of the Year, different kinds of words of the year. So while there's attempts to sort of get rid of some terms here and there, for the most part, we don't really see a concerted effort to actually remove vocabulary. We're more interested, most often, in adding vocabulary. And so thinking about vocabulary, there is still some controversy over vocabulary and loanwords, but most of this has died down and isn't really as relevant in present-day English and in the modern English time period. There are still some cases where Americans might avoid borrowings, especially from French. We see uproars every once in a while about the use of certain words and wanting to use different words. There's some British writers that have tried to use only Saxon terms and to avoid Latinate words, but none of these things really work, partly because without borrowings, English wouldn't really be the language it is today. Much of our present-day vocabulary is a result of borrowing. English has borrowed more words than many other languages in the world, and we rely on a lot of these borrowings for our everyday usage, for many things that we talk about in everyday life. About 80% of entries in our modern English dictionaries are borrowed words that aren't of Old English origin, that aren't Germanic in origin. In sheer number, most of these are from Latin, and this is coming from the early modern and modern time period. 60% of our words have Greek or Latin roots, sometimes directly from Latin, but also sometimes from French. So when we say that most of them are coming from Latin, it could be from Latin sort of historically or Latin directly. And so we have a few different sources for where we can get some of these kinds of words. But Latin sources are the most common that we see in present-day English. Most of the Greek words that we have either entered indirectly through Latin, directly from some Greek writers, or what we see most commonly is that they're formed in modern times from Greek elements. So this is especially true with things like scientific terms, with things like medical terms. These often still come from either Greek or Latin, even today as we're coming across new technology, as we're coming across new medical advances. A lot of those terms do still come from Greek and Latin even today. There have been even modern attempts, so we talked a lot about spelling reform in the early modern period, but even in modern English, we do still see some attempts for spelling reform. Most of the focus is on consistency rather than trying to reform the entire system. So one of the struggles that some people have with our present-day spelling system is that it doesn't always fall in consistent patterns that are easy to see. We talk to people learning English often that, oh, well, maybe you just need to memorize some of these patterns or some of these words because they don't seem to have a pattern. Now that we've studied a lot of the history of these words, you can see a more clear pattern of many of them. But a lot of the attempts to reform these are coming from a focus on consistency and this emphasis on correct spelling, things like spelling bees. This is a very uniquely English thing, to have spelling bees, to focus on the correct spelling of things. A rise in this reform happened in Britain in the mid-19th century, trying to make learning easier, trying to help non-native speakers learn English by having a correct way to spell things and give them a clear answer to the way something is supposed to be done. There were people like Isaac Pitman and A.J. Ellis that proposed some extensive revisions to the alphabet. They created a 38-character phonotype alphabet in the late 1800s. A lot of these actually ended up in the IPA, even though they didn't stick in English as our regular spelling system, but did end up representing some of the sounds for symbols that we see in the IPA. And there's been other reforms that have also taken place since then. So in the late 19th and early 20th century, there were some organizations and individuals that had spelling reform as a really important part of what they wanted to do or what they wanted to accomplish. So there was this attempt at creating something called Anglic to become a new spelling in the 1940s. There were minimal changes to traditional spelling, however, and there wasn't really much that came out of that. George Bernard Shaw was also a well-known proponent of spelling reform. He actually left money in his will when he died to promote this new 40-character alphabet that he'd come up with. And as late as the 60s, Shaw had writings that were published in this alphabet, but so few people know of this spelling system that the efforts were sort of futile. It didn't actually come to any fruition because it wasn't something that was very widespread or very widely known. Some others were things that happened during colonial America. So there was an interest in reform as early as the late 1700s. Benjamin Franklin was known as a reformer that wanted to change the alphabet. He wanted to replace redundant letters, so get rid of things like C and J and things that had other letters that use the same spelling, and use phonemes like our theta, like the eth, like the N with the hook, like the S with the hatchet, which would represent our sh sound. And so there were attempts during this time to create reform, but most of the time they weren't all that successful. The most successful person at actually reforming American spelling during the modern English period would have been Noah Webster. So he's known for creating dictionaries, and he did a lot of spelling changes when he was working on these dictionaries. So during this time period, in the late 1800s and the late 1700s and early 1800s, his book A Grammatical Institute of the English Language retained a lot of spellings from Johnson's dictionary, but he started changing some words. So he wasn't trying to create a new alphabet or to create a completely different spelling system, but just sort of simplified things or changed things a little bit. So changing is with a Z to an IS, tongue with just UNG to tongue, TONGUE. So some of our American spellings are actually, many of our American spellings can be brought back to Noah Webster and his early work and his early dictionary work. This is also something that we see later on represented in an American dictionary of the English language. It only retained these spelling revisions that helped distinguish British spelling from American spelling. So rather than listing both, or rather than listing a British spelling at all, it only had these American ones like favor without a U instead of favor with a U, or really any of those other OU versus O examples. Meter with ER versus meter RE, check, CHECK, instead of check, CHEQUE. And these sort of British spellings are things that you still see in Canada, because Canada still has more influence from British spelling. Even if their pronunciation is closer to American English, their spelling system didn't undergo the same changes that the American spelling system did. So you still see some of those British spellings in Canadian writing that you don't see in American writing, even though the sound changes are different than the British and Canada. To give just a brief visual of Benjamin Franklin's attempt at changing the alphabet, you see some symbols that look very similar, that have their IPA symbols down below there, where a lot of them are very similar to the way that we would spell or pronounce them today. But there's a lot of others that towards the end there where you have T with a sort of crooked H to represent ch, and that sort of crooked H representing sh. So the use of new symbols was something that he was trying out, but again, it didn't end up sticking. Some of our more recent spelling things that have come about, there is a spelling society today. They have a website. They publish on relevant spelling issues. They even have sort of jokes and spelling poems. So they rhyme words that don't look alike. They use phonetically spelled poems. So you may have come across this at some point. This one is called Candidate for a Pulitzer Prize rather than Pulitzer prize. I have a spelling checker. It came with my PC. It plainly marks for my review mistakes I cannot see. And you'll notice that you can read that and it pronounces the way that makes sense and everything, but it's all with different words that are spelled differently than the one you would expect to see if you were using the correct spelling for that particular word. So it shows and sort of plays with the different kinds of spellings that we have. And we can see that spelling isn't always as easy as people want to say it is, even though we do have a sort of codified spelling system. Not everyone spells things with the correct spelling or the way that people expect them to. In 2002, there was a survey that asked 1,000 adults in the United States to spell 6 different words, and the words were accommodation, business, height, necessary, separate, and sincerely. The one that was most correctly spelled was height, and 16% of people still misspelled that. And only 27% of these adults spelled accommodation correctly. So even with a set spelling, even with things like spelling bees, even with telling people this is how you are supposed to spell things, people are still not consistent with their spellings. And we see that happening even today. David Crystal is a linguist who has studied a lot about internet language and digital language, and also just spelling and pronunciation, has discussed some of the pitfalls in trying to simplify this, especially because you can't really base everything on pronunciation, partly because of the impossibility that it would be reprinting books, but also how you're supposed to represent particular regional aspects in spelling. So keeping our spelling system consistent, as we mentioned in early modern English, is actually an asset for helping us to understand the ways that we can sort of communicate between dialects. There are still issues that arise linguistically, so if we're trying to do a linguistic transcription, especially if we're doing discourse transcription, trying to understand how people are pronouncing things, especially if it's relevant, there's many theories on how to represent the spelling or to change it, or if you're supposed to change it at all for variations in pronunciation. And there's a lot of ethical concerns and conversations that happen in sociolinguistics as a result of that. And then finally, just a few things sort of connecting with early modern English and thinking about the dictionaries that we have today. From the early modern English period, when we saw the rise of Johnson's dictionary and Webster's dictionaries that were starting at the beginning of the modern English period, the most dominant dictionary that we have for English today is the Oxford English Dictionary, which you've used throughout this class. This began as a project in the mid-1800s, and it's now the premier sort of list of what exists and what existed in the history of English. So this was based on historical principles. It was meant to include every word that's appeared in English since the year 1000. Later they changed this to 1150. There's not as much documentation prior to 1150, so that period of time of French rule really affected what they could actually consistently say is from previous times. So this is why you'll notice that there's years given for things after about 1150, but prior to that, they'll just list OE as Old English to sort of say this is from before we were keeping track of dates. This was first issued in print in 1884. They finalized it in 1928 and added some supplements, and it's actually still supplemented over and over again. There's over 2.5 million quotations from written sources in the Oxford English Dictionary, so it's based primarily on written forms. So they take things that are written and use that as examples to define the word and how they're used in context. So anytime it's going to be updated or entered into the dictionary, it has to be found in writing somewhere. They don't use spoken forms for it. So they can be a little bit behind some of the more advanced and some of the more recent changes, but they're still ongoing. And so as the language continues to change, there's updates that are constantly happening. They post updates a few times a year now, and there's usually about 1,000 to 2,000 new entries every time. So they're frequently adding a lot of new forms as they become more common, as they're more talked about, as they become more useful. So you don't typically see highly regionalized slang or things in the Oxford English Dictionary unless they become more widespread and unless they become more commonly used across different dialects. And then finally, some things about some of the dictionaries. American dictionary making has been most influenced by Noah Webster, so he wrote the first major dictionaries of American English. And so that dictionary in 1828 had over 70,000 entries. It was the largest dictionary to date. But there were some different problems. So including pronunciations, this had a bias towards New England pronunciations. It didn't have quite as accurate of etymologies as what Johnson's dictionary had. So it wasn't that it was just a better dictionary. There were still some flaws with that. And we see some changes happening with that as time goes on. So George and Charles Merriam bought the publishing rights to that when Webster's died. And this is where we get Merriam-Webster today. So the unabridged editions have editions as recent as 2002 that are sort of print editions. It's now also updated regularly online for advances in technology. And Merriam-Webster has become very prolific on Twitter, also talking about changes in words. They became part of the conversation on singular they in the last several years, and documenting, how far back that usage actually goes. So they are still very constantly adding to and updating it, but this is a more American-focused dictionary rather than the Oxford English Dictionary that talks about English from a variety of places. And since these times, from just American and British forms, many other dictionaries have developed. We have online dictionaries like dictionary.com now. Many print dictionaries have their own online formats as well. And many other national varieties of English also have their own dictionaries. So there are Scots English dictionaries, Canadian English dictionaries, Australian, Indian, South African, lots of material for English language learners that are based on these dictionaries and based on the different dictionaries in various countries. So there's a lot that has still continued to change regarding some of the things that started in early modern English. We're still seeing an attempt to document things, and the use of linguistics has helped a lot with many of these attempts. So the final lecture that we have coming up after this is going to focus on some of the linguistic highlights, but this gives you some of the more social highlights that are still related to the language itself. So if you have questions, let me know, and we'll talk about these things in class.